This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and
I'm back. This is Mathias Fueling, back in the studio. It's been a minute. Steve has been out having adventures. He was in Cuba.
Yeah.
Like outside of Havana, or like in Havana for a while.
All of Cuba.
Like the whole island?
The whole island, Mathias. And it's good, and it's so funny. It's good to see you too, Mathias, after a long break. And one thing that you learn from travel, right, is like that you see all these amazing places and you see all these amazing things and the history's there and there's, it's beautiful beaches and things like that. But it's really the people that matter. And like the best part of my travel through Cuba is the people that I met, and hopefully they're listeners and subscribers now. but you make human, meaningful connections, and that's the most important thing. And then I come back to Philadelphia, and it's good to be in my office, and it's good to be back to work. But again, it's the human connection, and it's good to see you, and it's good to see that the history department at Temple is just. What a lucky department to have such good. If I toot my own horn.
Oh wow, yeah, we're
what are we talking about?
Self-complimentary.
What are we talking about today, Mathias?
We are talking about human rights, and around that, just sort of rights in general. What do they mean? Why are they important? Because if you sort of have your ear to the news these days, you hear lots of talk about human rights, about violations of human rights. Particularly right now in the news, is very topical, is the Trump administration's policy of separating children from their parents, particularly their mothers, of refugees or aka air quotes, like illegal aliens crossing the border. And many critics are saying that this is a violation of those people's human rights. Yeah. But what does that mean, right? When we talk, lots of people like to throw around the term human rights, but what do we actually mean when we say that? Like, what does that term fundamentally mean, and where does it come from historically?
Cool.
So that's what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so Hour of History, let's get back into the history then. And so when you're looking at human rights, like, there's always these people who want to say, okay, let's go back to the Greeks and Romans. Like, this is like a classic historical trope. But for our case, we'll go back to the Enlightenment. You could go back to the Magna Carta. Some people do that as well. But I'm not interested in that. I want to start in the Enlightenment.
Yeah, we can talk about those things a little later on.
But the Enlightenment, seems to be very, it came up on Twitter, right?
Again, the Enlightenment is another very big issue that lots of people are getting really worked up over. Lately, right, was the Enlightenment a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Did the Enlightenment create racism? Did it not create racism? Did the Enlightenment justify slavery? And basically, a lot of these arguments are, do what we think of as human rights, aka humanism, in which all human beings are supposed to be equal and have these kind of natural rights that are incumbent based upon their status as being a human being, does that come out of the Enlightenment or does it not come out of the Enlightenment? And that seems to be the fault line for lots of people. And the stakes are high.
And that's a perfect setup. And within this argument is the sort of birth of human rights. So in the 17th century, this is mostly happening in Scotland. And one of the most famous philosophers, John Locke, sets forth this sort of idea of natural rights. He doesn't use human rights. He says natural rights. And he says they're the right to life, liberty, and property. So that's sort of like a foreground to this. There's the Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights is adopted, which is more to limit the king's actions.
What year is that?
This is 1689.
Yeah, it's part of the the English Civil War and the English Revolution.
And the beginnings of the Enlightenment. And you have these religious changes. Big changes are happening in Europe. But it's not until the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, that we start to see these terms of human rights. And so this is where the historian Lynn Hunt sort of starts her argument. She goes off this like Benedict Anderson concept of nations are built through newspapers and sort of like through the written word. Yeah. And she says it happens through literature. The human rights, Rousseau and Voltaire and Diderot start using words that are maybe not directly human rights, but close to human rights.
Kind of like humanism. There's like a dignity to human beings, a dignity to mankind, that type of thing.
Social contract. This should hopefully ring bells from high school.
Yeah. What makes human beings civilized is our like recognition of the inner worth of each other. Yada yada yada, that whole thing.
And her argument is sort of like, by reading this and by creating this in the human imagination, human rights are born. Anyway, and then in 1776, there's a big event.
Yeah, we have the American Revolution, which again is also a topic that's being fiercely debated here in the States, right? Was Jefferson a good guy? Was he not a good guy? All of these so-called Enlightenment, human rightsy, rights-talking founding fathers. A lot of them own slaves. What's up with that? So these are also, again, topics of major conflict. But yeah, I mean, the Civil War or the American Revolution is often seen as like kind of the standing up of like the little guy for his rights, for their, dignity and their worth in the face of a tyrannical government. And then the Bill of Rights, of course, is saying that this government is justified because it secures these rights for its citizens that cannot be violated.
Right. So Thomas Jefferson, when he's writing these documents, for American independence, he, a guy who owns slaves, right, is writing that all men are created equal. And for our purposes, we could say men is humans, right, at that point, because, okay, that came out wrong. No, but at that time, men are the ones who have political agency.
Yeah, well,
even that is...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think anytime we're talking about the Enlightenment and we're reading about rights, I think it's important to recognize that the scope of who they consider to be within the bounds of proper humanity is very limited.
Yeah.
To white male property owners, right? That's
much.
That's basically that's the community that they're concerned with. And of course, you can't give rights to women, and I'm speaking in the voice of these people because, like, we all know that women are inferior and they're irrational.
Or at least they have a certain duty.
Or they have duties, but they just don't have the same capacity, which puts them outside of, like, this same rights-bearing community. Non-white peoples, or particularly black people, don't have rights because at this time people don't even really think of them as human. They think of them as barbaric, less civilized. They're not part of the civilized community. People of other religions, right, particularly say like Muslims or any other kind of major religion, are also considered like heretical, as also kind of barbaric. They're also not really considered within the bounds of a proper rights-bearing community.
And it's quite easy to see how these become contentious issues today.
Yeah.
But so...
but the words do sound very, like, universal.
Right, and we should focus on a couple words, and maybe we can come back to them, are the words Jefferson uses. He talks about endowment with rights and inalienable rights. So these are sort of rights that you're born with, and he changes Locke a little bit. It's no longer life, liberty, and property, but the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
But we all know that, hey, property is happiness, right?
Oh,
Can you buy happiness?
I don't know. Well, okay, maybe.
So, anyways,
you should have said life, liberty, and the good old dollar bill.
Life, liberty, and the Benjamins.
And the Benjamins. Was Benjamin Franklin on the dollar at that point?
Well, the $100 bill, I don't think that happened until what? Like, the 20th century? I don't know.
Anyway, okay, so we move on. 1789, shortly before the Bill of Rights in the United States is actually created. 1789 is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen.
And that's the French kind of constitution that's declared after the Revolution. Another, what's popularly conceived as another like Enlightenment-inspired revolution, much more radical than the American Revolution, saying like we want to totally overthrow the existing social order. We want to get rid of kings, queens, aristocrats, all the nobility, and we want to create a kind of representative system of the people. And the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen gives the people of France, but also declares these universal rights for all humans.
And this is, we'll talk more about him later, but this is where the historian Samuel Moyne at Yale sort of enters the conversation.
It's kind of like the dark horse of the Enlightenment discourse these days.
Right. So he says this is like human rights 1.0, because you look at the Declaration of Independence and the U.S., and then you look at the Declaration of Rights of Man, and they're both serving the purpose of pushing back against government. They're not so interested in lifting up the person as much as they are getting rid of the king.
Well, the presumption, I think, with these declarations, these revolutions, is that a monarchical government led by a king, led by a queen, that has the kind of like principle that God grants certain individuals greater status in society, the idea is that that government is an encroachment upon the rights of human beings, that government is inherently tyrannical, that government can't help but abuse the people under its rule. And so then, of course, these revolutions say what we're doing is we're pushing back against this tyrannical government. We are against monarchy, and we're about creating a representative government that preserves a sphere for the exercise and preservation of people's rights.
Right, and it's tested quite early on because France has a colony, the colony in the in Latin America, in the Caribbean, called Haiti.
Yeah, just a small little island that nothing.
It's just like the world's piggy bank at that point.
Yeah,
with sugar.
But again, this is another point: is that the big issue with all of this is slavery, right? Because Haiti is a major slave colony of the French Empire at the time of the Revolution. And ding, 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 another big thing lots of historians are talking about these days is that slavery is really critical to the rise of modern capitalism, because slavery is, basically almost free labor that you're utilizing to create a shitload of profit for the empire and for merchants. And so this little tiny island of Haiti, right, is like, yeah, as you said, it's the piggy bank because it's where they're utilizing a ton of black slaves from Africa to, harvest and grow sugarcane, which then they can sell for an enormous profit.
And I don't want to get lost in Haiti because
but it's important.
Every single time, I teach a class, give a lecture, it seems like Haiti always comes up because it's so important. I just want to go,
Well, it's a wild event.
There's so much depth that you can take from Haiti. And anyway, but so in 1791, just a couple years after this Declaration of Rights of Man, the slaves revolt in Haiti, and Haiti becomes the second republic in the Western world. It really becomes the second sort of Enlightenment republic.
Except with the thing, it's also the only, I think, successful slave revolt in the Americas.
It's also a black republic.
It's also a black republic, which, again, goes back to these racial fault lines of human rights discourse in the Enlightenment.
And so human rights is challenged, and so, again, this is about human rights, so we're not going to dwell on Haiti, but human rights is challenged right away with, okay, you're saying that these rights go to all men. Let's see if it's true, France. And then
it turns out that France is a little suspicious about extending rights to all people.
Right, and they, as if they didn't. They don't really have stability to do it anyway. Yeah. So at times slavery becomes over in the French Revolution, but then it's reinstated.
And it's reinstated under Napoleon, I think.
Yeah.
But so eventually, not to get into the details of Haiti, but eventually, right. The Haitian Republic is invaded by France. I think at least twice. Yeah, by Republican forces and then by forces under Napoleon, kind of putting the lie to the idea that the revolutionary government is 100% committed to the idea that all rights are going to all people.
And France doesn't recognize Haiti until the middle of the 19th century. Haiti has to pay back debt for the slaves that gained their own freedom. They had to pay that back. United States doesn't recognize Haiti until after the Civil War. Actually, during the Civil War. So,
and then we're leaving off the whole point of there's slavery in the United States up until the Civil War, which is also contentious because if all men are created equal, why can some people own people?
Right, and that's why. This is sort of like human rights. So is human rights just a fable then? We have, we're dating back to 1760s, 1770s, 80s, 90s. We're talking decades of people reading these documents that say everyone has rights. And time again, they say, well, everyone but not slaves. Or, well, everyone but not women. So is human rights 1.0? Is it just a myth? Is it just a...
I don't know. I think, sure, you can look at it and definitely say there's hypocrisy to it. I think what it really comes down to is how did people then define who was human?
Yeah.
Right? Because anytime you hear human rights, we just sort of assume, well, that's everybody. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that at that time, as I sort of said earlier, the idea of who counted as human, truly human, was a contentious issue. And that sounds a little crazy to us now, but it was something that lots of people in the past had a very narrow definition of who actually was a real human being.
And one place in which that comes really to ground is during war.
Yeah. So how do you want to do? Do you want to like speed up through kind of the mini history? Because I would like to talk about some wartime issues.
We're gonna get there. Yeah. So war is an important thing. We have to say in the middle of the 19th century is the first part of the Geneva Convention. So that is protecting human rights of soldiers. So if someone's sick or wounded, the European powers agree that these people are given rights. So you can't just, you leave them to die.
Yeah, and you can't just indiscriminately slaughter prisoners of war.
And then, so we move on to
civilians.
To the beginning of the 20th century. The Hague Conventions codify laws that make sort of procedures so war can be settled. They limit weapons that can be used for mass killing, and they provide basically rules of war are created. So this is also seen in development of human rights. But then just 15 years later, the genocide of the Armenians happens with, after World War I, 1.5 million Armenians at least are killed, and Russia, France, and the United Kingdom declare it a crime against humanity. So this is where we start to see the sort of like international reaction to human rights violations.
Yeah.
So if someone makes a violation, a crime against humanity, and this has echoes going to the Iraq War, sure, we'll talk about this too. When do you intervene to protect human rights with weapons? So that happens. World War I, ends with the Treaty of Versailles.
And World War I also uses lots of poison gas, which is, as far as I'm aware, excepting for the Iran-Iraq War and really nasty incidents in the Syrian Civil War, basically have been sort of considered taboo ever since. Those are against many, many, many international treaties that you can't use gas in war.
And so this is kind of like...
Even in World War II, the great powers didn't use gas, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, excepting, Hitler gassing Jews in extermination camps, but like on the battlefield, poison gas was not utilized by anybody.
And this is kind of where human rights meeting law is successful. So when the lawyers, the legislators can get together and put laws together that go across international borders that defend human rights, there are potentially some measures of success. Maybe it'll come up later in our discussion. We won't dwell on it, but there's the issue of colonialism and sort of the rights of people like Indians to make their own money. The salt marches by Gandhi, those can be...
Yeah, and I think it's important, to point out at the same time that we're talking about the expansion of human rights, this is also a time of the expansion of European empires and the expansion of colonialism. And how those fault lines are going to blow up very quickly after World War II.
Yeah, and in 1941, FDR makes the Four Freedoms speech. So he says that after post-war, so he's already thinking of the end of World War II as early as 1941. He says there needs to be freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those are his sort of four freedoms, and this is like predecessors to the United Nations, which is formed in 1942 while the war is still going, and on the basis of these sort of globalization, these global governmental agreements, the United Nations, it takes years to develop, but eventually this is like beginning to transition from human rights 1.0 to human rights 2.0.
In the words of Sam Moyne.
In the words of Sam Moyne, where it's not quite yet. He says the 2.0 doesn't come till the 70s, but it's the beginning of the transition. So the UN comes together and puts together the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which is sort of like a modern global version of the U.S. and French declarations.
Yeah, and that sort of says, doesn't it, right? I think you have it in your hand right now, but right? It basically sort of says, like, all humans have certain rights, inalienable rights that are given to them by their very status of being a human being, and everybody is a human being. I think it's sort of taken for granted at this point by the UN Declaration. And doesn't it also, like, that the UN has, like, a right or, like, a duty to intervene in international affairs to protect human rights or to prevent violations of human rights?
So this is where it's kind of interesting, and this is like a very interesting part of the whole human rights discussion, is that the UN puts that forth, and people kind of think like, well, this isn't going to do any, we had the US one, and we had the French one, and we have this idea going on. The UN puts the idea forth, But what happens after World War II is organizations like Amnesty International come out and they start putting the UN to task. So when the UN doesn't defend violations of human rights, groups like Amnesty International and Oxfam go and do the work. They enforce the UN. So they're sort of working as a branch of the United Nations. Like Amnesty International starts as working for rights of prisoners, right? So their idea is they're going to work with this declaration that the UN put forth, and they're going to make sure that no one's violating the rights of prisoners. And they do this very successfully from the 1960s on and become one of the most important organizations in the world. So that's where the kind of transition happens, where human rights now has defenders beyond the nation.
Yeah, like third-party actors or something.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's important, too. So that's like kind of the brief timeline in a nutshell of human rights.
Right.
I think what's interesting about human rights, and I think particularly what's important and interesting given our debates now about globalization and nationalism and the rise of Trump and everything, is there is, I think, a kind of inherent sort of tension between, on the one hand, human rights, the idea that you have rights given to you as a human being, and then, on the other hand, civic rights given to you by your government, right? By, the country or the nation that you are a part of. And how those sometimes, like, they seem like pretty, like, locked at the hip, but oftentimes they can be very different. They can diverge in really weird ways.
And this is also a huge issue because we know borders change, nationalities change, and especially this happens after World War II. It happens in the colonial...
It happens all the time. So like the example I was talking about earlier at the very beginning of the episode was, say, basically illegal immigrants, right? Like people who are just going across the southern U.S. border. And then, they get rounded up by ICE or by the Border Patrol. Then they, end up in, some, like at the parking lot of a former Walmart. Literally what's happening. And then the question is, in the status of people like that, but not just that. Say, for example, in World War II, there's all kinds of crazy examples in World War II of, this weird issue of human rights versus, states' rights or civic rights. So, if you're, say, a citizen of, say, Poland in, 1939... Well, let's say the Nazis invade, so you flee and you flee east, and then you end up in territory that is invaded by the Soviet Union, and then you flee to another country, and then from there you're able to get passage to, for example, Cuba.
Yeah.
And then the question is, who are you at that point? Who's looking out for your rights? Because we often talk a lot of times as if something goes down in another country and you're there, your government will protect you.
And that's where human rights are still a political issue. So human rights doesn't have a good track record when it's up to the government to defend, because you look at all these issues where these people, let's take the example of the Jews again at World War II, saw themselves as Germans, were highly secular.
Yeah, and this is a classic, and I think this is a good, the Holocaust, I think, is just, all of these issues come so clearly to the front in the Holocaust.
So important to study, yeah. So you have these people who are German, right? So their government needs to protect their rights, because there's no Amnesty International that's going to go into Germany and say, why are you locking up these Jews? At the time, anyway. So the German Jews had no one to protect their rights because it's highly politicized, and the Germans say, you're not part of our nation.
Yeah. And so you see a lot of Jews end up as stateless people, I think was the official terminology, where they're basically disavowed by their own governments, and then they have nowhere to go. And no one wants to take them in as refugees because of the visa program, right? You can't accept somebody into your country if they don't officially belong to another country, right?
Exactly.
Or if you end up in another country illegally, what laws govern you? How are you going to, what rights do you have at that point?
Yeah, what laws protect you?
Yeah, what laws protect you, basically. And so there's a lot of arguments that have been made regarding the Holocaust, particularly by Hannah Arendt, most famously in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, and then more recently...
There's going to be a movie about that.
And I saw that Operation Finale or something.
Looks incredible.
Yeah, Oscar Isaac, anyways, they paid us to say that.
Kingsley, Gandhi.
Yeah. Oh, he's in it?
Yeah.
Oh, cool, man. Yeah, I'll probably watch it. That sounds right up my alley.
Yeah.
And then Tim Snyder, another kind of new wave historian of the Holocaust, is saying that the Holocaust was always much worse. Like, more Jews died in areas where they were stateless than in places in Europe where they had strong governments that were still willing to flex like their governmental power to protect them as citizens. And so it's a tension now, I think, across the world where you're seeing huge amounts of refugees, particularly, say, for example, in Syria. Like, what laws are refugees under? You know, because we can say, well, what the U.S. is doing is a violation of people's human rights, and I agree with that, right? What's happening, you know, in at the southern border and separating parents from their children or children from their parents is horrible, and it's a violation of their human rights. The real question, though, then, is how do you enforce human rights? That's the real turning point, because human rights are seen as universal, right? They're seen as encompassing everybody, and yet the world doesn't have it has the United Nations. But the United Nations is really almost more like a council. Like, it's not like a body in and of itself, right? The United Nations has a council and they make votes. And then there's 6 or 7 countries that have veto power. They can shoot 5 countries. They can shoot down any basically sort of like idea or like, you know, attempted legislation or declaration that the UN wants to put out. So the UN actually has very little power to flex its muscles. It can really put out a lot of like scolding statements like, oh, look, that's so horrible, and it can do lots of studies, but it's not like the UN is going to say, if you don't like start actually, you know, getting your act together, America, or getting your act together, say Syria, for example, and you're quit violating the human rights of people, we're going to, I don't know, invade you and stop that.
Yeah.
The UN really has no power.
Well, but this is exactly where I study and what I study, because this is where the organizations that basically keep the UN afloat come in, and when these organizations act well and behave properly, then they're very successful. So you have NGOs that work with the UN that go to support people who have had their human rights violated. And I think those organizations their importance can't be overstated. But then you have organizations like Oxfam who go and abuse their power. And I think one of to bring it back to Haiti, one of the good examples of this that doesn't necessarily deal with refugees is the sort of post-earthquake Haiti, where it was Haitians in Haiti, and it became this republic of NGOs, and you know what? One time Clinton was asked, you know, how many NGOs are in Haiti, and he said, I don't know, there's probably like 10,000.
And they made them worse. They demonstrably hurt Haiti.
Yeah, so the UN sort of had that one thing going for it to check on human rights, is like, because when the Security Council fails, maybe these NGOs can go and help out. And NGOs, a lot of times, like the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, are granted access. They're among the first to be invited into the Israel-Palestine conflict after World War II, because they're one of the only organizations in the world that worked with both Palestinians and Jews in World War II. And so these organizations have an enormous amount of potential to protect human rights, but often because of the sort of handicaps of having to donate and get money, and sort of you're sort of beholden to those who give you money, the organizations become very corrupt. And that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think so we're going to go, I think, now, like, kind of in talking about the more cynical side of human rights. So they sound great, right? Like, the innate dignity and rights of all human beings, and, you know, and we have, like, all, you know, you have a right to happiness, you have a right to shelter, you have a right to da-da-da-da-da. And then, but then, as we said earlier, right, it's really hard to enforce that, because you say these rights are universal, but we don't have a universal government yet. We still have nation states. So it's either incumbent upon an individual nation state to enforce those rights. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's really kind of up in the air. Or you have these, like, NGOs, these, like, third parties that are not governmental. They're not governments per se, but they claim to be acting in the name of human rights. But then they only get their ability to operate on an international scale from money given to them by governments, by nations, by the UN, right? They use human rights very quickly becomes a kind of that becomes like their product, right? That becomes like what they market, and so it's very easy for them to be corrupted, right? Like in the case example of Haiti after the earthquake, where, you know, they're not following protocol, tons of money that was supposed to go to the Haitian people gets squirreled away by people, and it's really hard to criticize like an NGO or find out what's going on, because, like, who has control over an NGO. By their very nature, they're supposed to be like dispassionate third parties. They're not affiliated with anybody. And so the cynical side of people would say that human rights is kind of like a BS term. Like it's more a term that people use, that governments particularly use to sound good, but really use it as kind of like a political club to like beat their opponents over the head and use it to justify their own governmental actions, or it's like a political club that NGOs use for their own sort of, organizational gain. And I think a big example of this is the actions of the United States in the last few decades, where, the United States often claims internationally that it's acting in the name of human rights. It'll say, right, we are like an Enlightenment republic. We were founded on like the idea of human rights, of the rights, these universal sort of norms of civilized society and whatnot. And that the United States has a kind of duty, like an almost like quasi-religious like calling to create liberty and democracy across the world, and also implicit in that, right, is defending and spreading human rights.
Right. Yeah. Jimmy Carter said.
But that's also then a good smokescreen for just allowing the U.S. to do whatever it wants internationally.
Well, but it's not like I think that's an oversimplification.
Okay,
because
I'm the more cynical.
Jimmy Carter says America did not invent human rights. Human rights invented America. And so then that kind of, it puts the burden on the United States of sort of enforcing these human rights laws. And so maybe with this we can get into the Security Council a little bit, where the United Nations Security Council meets and decides if there are these human rights violations, and they have a vote, so they have the 5 permanent members and then some additional members that on a rotating basis. And if they carry out a unanimous vote out of the 12 that are there, then they go investigate the human rights violation. Recently, it's not worked well because Russia and the United States typically disagree. China often does as well, because their official policy is leave human rights to the nation that's doing it.
Yeah, and we all know that if you do that, the nation then has no incentive to actually enforce human rights.
If you do what?
If you just leave it to the nation itself.
Right. Well, so that's kind of the issue that we're at, right? Nations between each other and nations going in. So let's take one case. Let's take the Iraq War, where the United States says there's a human rights violation here.
Yeah, they say this is like the best face argument for why we invaded Iraq, or sort of like the official kind of Bush administration line is. Saddam Hussein is an evil totalitarian dictator. He abuses the Iraqi people. He's oppressive. He kills lots of people. The whole 9 yards of what you think of as a nasty ruler. He uses gas on his own people. He's committing genocide against the Kurds in the north. He's also, breaking all kinds of international laws by trying to buy plutonium on the black market so he can enrich, like a nuclear plant and build nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons. And that's all like a violation of international law and a violation of human rights. And so we as the United States, now that we're like in this new era of the war on terror, we have like this duty to go into Iraq and liberate the people and restore their human rights. Like that was like the Bush line.
Right. So, but in looking at human rights...
And we all know how great Iraq worked out.
Well, no, but yeah, of course, the way it turns out is, and
there was no plutonium, and we know that like that whole intelligence was
but in
manipulated.
terms of human rights, and in terms of no one there to defend the human rights, I think to me that's the number one sort of problem of human rights is we have these nations that are behind walls violating human rights. I mean, it was pretty clear that there was like Kurds' human rights were being violated.
This is not to say that Saddam obviously was doing horrific things, and he obviously was slaughtering the Kurds. I mean, I'm not trying to be a Saddam apologist by any means, right? Saddam was a horrible, evil person, and his regime was horrible and terrible. At the same time, the invasion of Iraq by the United States was not, I think, as rosy-hued and as idealistic as it was made to sound by the administration, and it was a horrible foreign policy decision that sort of blew our foot off going into the 21st century. Right,
and so our human rights then you're cynical because they're just up to the nation.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. Like, is going back earlier, like I said, this tension between civic rights and human rights is every nation wants to talk about human rights, but every nation really can only enforce its own civic rights, right? And the nations like the major superpowers can claim to have the ability to intervene internationally in the name of human rights. And the cynical argument would be that this makes it easy for great powers, say the United States, say Russia, for example, to invade other countries or do all kinds of other stuff internationally, claiming it's doing it in the name of human rights, right? And so the idea is that human rights, well, they sound good on the grand political scale, just are kind of meaningless because it just becomes like an idea that I said earlier, people just use like a political club against each other, and they're not actually implemented as they should be, which is not to say that human rights aren't a beautiful idea. It's just that they're not working on the international scale. And this is something also something like Sam Moyn argues, right? He tries to say that human rights are kind of like hollowed out on, right, on the international playing field.
And it's not the sort of like end all issue that people wish it would be. Like, I think that's the sort of idealism, is like when you come across people who are working for human rights, or like say people who are working on the immigration cases in the United States, it's clear there's a human rights violation there, but it's so embedded in other legal issues that it's really hard you can't distill human rights away from other things. Does that make sense? Yeah,
no, I think it's true. And I think as well, like with political theorists, this is like a big issue, right? Is that, how do you even talk about human rights in nation states? Like, how do they, again, like this dichotomy I've been talking over and over again, but like I think it's so important because, human rights by their definition are universal. They apply to all humans. But then, nation states are particular, governments are particular, right? They're based in like a very specific area of the world with specific peoples, with specific laws. And so this was something that some people have criticized, is that, well, human rights, a great power that's claiming to be acting in the name of human rights is really claiming that it has the right to do anything it wants on the international scale. It basically is saying it's leaving behind its identity as a nation state in some sense, right? This is like a lot of the criticism of the U.S. with the Iraq War, is like this idea that the U.S. is sort of implicitly not a nation state anymore because it's claiming that it's like its justification for existence and its international actions are going to be global. It's going to be universal because it's acting in the name of human rights, which therefore means that the United States is declaring it has the duty to intervene anywhere, at any time, in any country. And yet, at the same time, right, the United States is not it's not the world government, and nation states, have, their own national interests, and it doesn't make for a very peaceful world when you have one big government intervening globally. That makes a lot of tension between other governments, particularly smaller countries who may feel that they have basically lost their sovereignty because they're always going to be liable to be intervened with in the name of human rights by another great power.
But there's not, in addition to that, there's the whole fact that, like, even if there were one country taking check like the United States does not ensure all the human rights that are enshrined in the UN Declaration. And it's sort of like and human rights are also ever expanding. So we could argue that each human has a right to like a clean and healthy earth, right? And so the Paris agreements were kind of moving towards that, and the United States pulls out of that. So in a way, the United States is violating the rights of its own people. There's no one that's going to check the United States on that because no one's going to invade the United States. So that's the problem to me here. Looking at that is the nation. And the nation at the same time is getting much stronger during the Enlightenment when the idea of human rights are coming out. So like all these new ideas are coming out of the Enlightenment, and at the same time they're contradictory. Because someone with human rights, your human right is to be free, and you have the right to move, right? So the movement is a human right. If you don't want to live in Scotland, you can walk to England, you can take a boat to Ireland. But the nation state prevents that.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something like lots of people are saying, is that anybody should have the ability to come into the U.S. at any time because human rights and right of movement. But again, that does threaten sort of national sovereignty, right? And how like nations like internally how they operate is like idealistically, right? Everyone like you have like a bureaucracy, and you have all these civil servants, and the government's funded by taxes, and citizens pay their taxes, and they have like certain protections and certain laws that are given upon them by being good citizens, and there's a police force, and there's a justice department, and da 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 da. The problem is, if you have an ideology or an idea of free movement of peoples, the nation state can't function, right? Like, you can't, it just will collapse. The nation state is inherently based on being bounded within borders.
Yeah.
And so, as you said earlier, right, again, they're contradictory. And so it's a problem we have where I think internationally, like globally, I should say, people are recognizing that we're dealing with global issues, right? Global warming is global, right? Like, it's not going, or like, climate change is a global, it's going to affect everybody. And yet, at the same time, there's just no way that one individual country can confront it. And at the same time, the problems that are going to be created, say, people leaving areas of the world that are going to be inhospitable, for example, that's going to start to really, threaten the status and sovereignty of individual nation states. And so it's sort of this weird tension of, we don't really have another, I guess, good alternative besides this kind of ideology of like a global government, but no one knows what that would look like.
Well, I don't think anyone's ready or willing to submit to anything that looks like that. I mean, because they've been tried before. Like, the League of Nations was supposed to be like this, at least we will talk about it before we start invading each other, and it didn't work. And then the United Nations was sort of a similar thing. Like, let's have a council before these things happen, and it's been unsuccessul. So we had like two predecessors to that, but even like from the start of the United Nations, where are the headquarters of the United Nations? New York City. So, the U.S. has always been in charge of the United Nations, and even putting Taiwan in the seat of China until the 1970s. I mean, come on, how is the international government going to work in that way? So, the trouble with global government, I mean, and even under a global sort of governance, then what would stop everyone from moving to the most desirable parts of the earth?
Exactly. Or, again, this would be the question is, like, if we have a kind of a global governance, how do you, if it starts to abuse its power,
how do you check that?
How do you check that? Yeah, exactly. And so these are real issues, right? These are very intense political issues because we know that, these problems are only going to get worse as time goes on, right? We know right now in China, for example, there's massive oppression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang in northwestern China by the Chinese government, right? The Uyghurs are predominantly a Muslim, sort of Turkish ethnic group. And we know they're getting rounded up and being put in concentration camps and like being forced to submit to like basically political re-education.
It's illegal to have a beard.
What?
It's illegal to have a beard.
Yeah. I mean, they're basically, China is stomping out Islam in that area of the world because it's terrified of kind of basically a Muslim insurrection or uprising that could threaten its power. We all know, like, inherently, come on, that's a violation of some sort of human dignity and human right. But no one's going to enforce that. No one's going to call out China.
No, well, we helped China. China actually started the persecution of the Uyghurs after 9/11 when the U.S. said, we'll support any government.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're seeing all these issues, right, where self-evidently also we know that the United States, right, has done all kinds of horrible human rights violations, even at the time it's talking about human rights, let alone the history of slavery and racial oppression here in the country, but just like internationally, like the funding of the Contras in Central and South America in the 80s, right? Like, and then the Contras go on to, like, be paramilitary death squads. Like, we know that that's wrong. We know that there's something grotesque about that a lot of people would say that's like inherently a violation of human rights. But, at the same time, the United States is waging the Cold War against the Soviet Union in the name of human rights, and so I think there's a lot of, that's, I guess, again, going back to this problem is that human rights sound good, but they're sort of inherently unenforceable.
Well, this is where I really like Lynn Hunt's argument about the sort of power of literature and media to shape human perspectives of human rights. Because if you go back like 10 or 15 years, being gay was illegal in America, right?
Yeah, which again, I think actually that's a good point. That is, I think, perhaps the most successful example of the expansion of an ideology of human rights to a particular minority of people ever. And
it happened extraordinarily fast quickly with the use of media
in our lifetimes.
Film, books, and it's continuing, the sort of information.
Because it's now a global thing. I mean, it's no longer just about, the United States. It's about, like, that's a huge international issue, is where does this country stand on the issue of gay rights and of gay marriage?
Right. And that has changed very rapidly. And so I kind of like her argument, and this going back to even Benedict Anderson, is when people start sharing these ideas of what is wrong and right, and when that begins to change, then people begin to change their governments. And that's not a fast process, and I think that might be the worst thing, is that, like, in terms of climate change or anything like that, it's changing so slowly, because minds are changing slowly and government changes slowly, that these kind of things sometimes don't happen quick enough.
Yeah. I think, kind of segueing off of that, I think also an issue with human rights discourse, or just think rights in general, is who gets to define what those are, right?
Well, they're inalienable.
Well, yeah, but who says they're inalienable? You know, right? Like, again, it's almost kind of like, in a sense, a religious kind of concept. Because, you know, there's no, like, show me I mean, this is going to sound like a stupid atheist point. Like, show me God under a microscope. But, like with human rights, you know, like, show me, like, a right under a microscope. But, like, what I mean is, like, rights are just ideas, right? They don't like, you can't touch a right. You know,
ideas of which there was no concept before.
And so I think it's interesting then, because they're ideas, the question is, well, who has the right to give rights? Or who has the right to take away rights? Which is like a weird concept, because, you know, who gets to define what these inalienable human rights are? I think lots of people, again, this going back to the Enlightenment, lots of people think like, well, you know, we go back to these big thinkers, we go back to these great philosophers who talk about, you know, dignity and the right to happiness and the right to this and the right to that. And then lots of criticisms are like, well, those are all sort of biased, you know, European white people who are part of this like resurgent imperial project. And they would say, you know, the Enlightenment is just sort of a smokescreen for the expansion of European power. More than that, though, it's also with who gets to define human rights. I think a really sort of intense issue is what happens when those rights come into conflict with each other, or can rights come into conflict?
Right.
And I think particularly, I think it was just, a few days ago, there was, or by the time this is posted, it'll be like a couple weeks ago, right, the Supreme Court's decision on the baker in Colorado, who, you know, he's like, I guess, evangelical or some sort of strain of like, you know, Christian. He's a baker, and there was a gay couple, and they're getting married, and they say, hey, you know, we're getting married, we want you to make us a wedding cake, and he refuses, saying, right, because of my religious beliefs, I don't want to make your cake. And he says, I have a religious right, because we think of, like, in America, this is often said, like, one of the great things about America is anybody can practice their religion, you know, freedom of religion for everybody. It's awesome, great. How does that come into conflict with people, like, providing, the interaction with people that, according to your religion, are bad?
And so this is the folly of human rights, because human rights suggests that, and I've heard it so many times, people say, it's my human right to do anything as long as I don't infringe on your human rights. Well, you know what? Your existence infringes on other people's human rights. The very fact that you exist where you do and consume what you do is already infringing on someone else's. So, like, when you talk about the developed world versus the underdeveloped world, like, don't talk to me.
Like, where do you buy your clothes? Who makes your clothes?
Exactly. Coffee, things like
who harvests your food? Those kinds of things.
You are always infringing on someone else's human rights because of the system, the global system that we live in. It's impossible to not infringe on someone's human rights. So this sort of argument that my human rights go until they impact your human rights, or that our human rights can butt up against each other, I think we need to see a more uniform. There's only one humanity. Like, we can't block off different humanities.
Well, idealistically, I would say no, and we shouldn't. But I think we know that happens all the time, right? Like, I think the scary thing. I'll go back to World War II. I think the scary thing. I think World War II showed us. Is that you can do that. Like, if a government is determined enough and the people of the country are determined enough, you can wipe out other populations that you perceive to be a threat to your, say, nation.
It's happening in Burma.
It's happening. It's happening. And the thing is, that happens all over the world. And I read, so there's this literary critic guy, I don't know if he's dead yet, George Steiner.
If you're not, we apologize.
You're not, sorry, George. Well, he's like a big deal. He's very old. He's in his late 80s, maybe early even 90s. And Steiner is he's like one of those grand, European kind of Renaissance intellectuals. I think he survived the Holocaust. And he was talking about how he went to India to go see like an exhibit on the Holocaust. And he said he was actually really stunned because he said he saw like some like nationalist types looking at him being like, oh, so this is how you do it. Oh, you know, and so I think sometimes we forget that we sort of assume that people will look at horrible genocides in the past and think, well, oh, the lesson is we shouldn't do these things. But inevitably, right, the other lesson can be, oh, so that's how you do it. And I think I'm terrified, and because I'm more pessimistic, that we may see a resurgence of mass sort of genocidal campaigns in the 21st century, because as humans start to move more because of climate change, because of political turmoil, as issues of national sovereignty become more and more and more topical, like particularly right in Europe with the refugee crisis, you see lots of European states shutting down their borders. I think we're eventually going to see some sort of nationalist leader. I don't think Trump is that one in the U.S., but maybe who knows if there's going to be someone like him coming after him.
Romney 2.0.
Or like a nice, polite, upstanding Trump who can get away with
Romney
more.
2.0. Watch out, world.
Yeah. I always joke that Romney looked like a Ken Barbie doll that had like been melted down like a little bit.
I thought he was Batman.
Oh, I guess so. Like an evil Bruce Wayne.
Evil.
Like he's the evil Batman. But I think that it's not going to be long before we start seeing more and more national leaders who are like explicitly say like the issue to our problem is we just need to get rid of these people that are like, causing issues with our questions of national sovereignty.
Right, and this is my soapbox. So people now are turning to the nation, which the nation can be a beautiful thing because, you're supporting someone that you don't know, you haven't seen, you have this idea
and
of
nations do provide a protection of rights. They do provide certain civic rights.
But people are turning to the nation in a negative way as a solution to a problem that is going to end up
as a solution to the problem of other nations or a solution to the problem of other populations.
And historically, nation as solution to other nation hasn't ended well.
No, it inevitably ends in war.
Right.
Or the destruction of the other nation.
Whereas people aren't turning to humans or human rights as sort of this answer because people don't want to share, because people don't want to give up what they have. So like, why is immigration an issue? I mean, I studied a lot of immigration, especially during the Holocaust, when times were bad. I mean, people remembered the Great Depression. The number one thing people always say is those immigrants are going to take my job. And if they take my job, I can't buy food. And if I can't buy food, I can't live. So the number one sort of critique of immigrants has always been they're going to take my job. And the people defending the immigrants have always said they can work within our system. And there's studies from economists on both sides that say, and the Mural boat lift from Cuba is a great example of this, where a bunch of Cubans go to Florida, and there's tons of economists who have argued the boat lift and the massive migration to Florida was great for the state. And there's tons of economists who have argued the massive migration to Florida was terrible for the state. And this argument is the center of this sort of discussion. And as long as people are afraid of losing their job and afraid of losing their life, immigrants won't be given rights. And when people aren't given rights, that's usually when it turns pretty nasty.
Yeah. Well, I think also, too, the weird discourse about immigration in the States is like the whole kind of meritocracy about immigration. Right, like what's the argument? Like you see this a lot. Is people say like, "Oh, well, of course we should stick immigrants." Like, look at Steve Jobs, the son of an immigrant. He made Apple, and that sounds like nice. You like read it kind of unquestioningly. You're like, "Oh yeah, obviously that's great. Like immigrants, innovation." But then it's like sort of almost like the assumption is like we need to bring in immigrants or the right immigrants because they do good things for us.
Yeah.
But it's sort of the implicit thing is like, well, what if you accept an immigrant who doesn't turn out to be Steve Jobs?
Yeah.
Does that person just not is there like worth as a human being less than these like meritocratic people that you let into your nation?
And Chong Rae Lee, a Korean author, wrote this very like dystopian novel a couple years ago where basically in this post world everyone's divided into certain charters where the useful people are here.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is something that like I think it's a sort of enormous foresight. This novel. That's kind of what we're going towards, where like you have these cities of the super rich like New York City where it's just totally totally stratified and totally separated, segregated between the sort of like the top class and what Harari says is going to become the useless class. I think that's a little harsh, and I'm not sure that that's the right word.
Well, like, and maybe not useless, but like people who don't have the skills that the nation wants or something, you know?
Right.
And I think a lot of that is kind of implicit in just the immigration debate in the United States. Is sort of implicit that like, oh, you know, some dude named Jose who like crosses the Rio Grande.
Why it's got to be Jose?
It could be, well, you know, it could, I don't know,
Slava.
It could be anybody, right? But I mean like a real world example.
Seriously,
like, yeah, like somebody who like say is from like southern Mexico, or maybe, you know, from like Nicaragua or something. Like they've been threatened by some gang or whatever. They can't get a job, so they're like, screw it, I'm going north. I'm going to El Norte. So like they cross the Rio Grande. They don't speak English. They don't really have any skills. Do they not have as much of a right, though, to come to the U.S. as, say, like some guy from, say, Ghana who has like a PhD, you know, and is like a surgeon or something?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our immigration debate is sort of floating on, like, we're not against immigration, but we're just against, like, the wrong immigrants coming. Like, we want the good people to come. We don't want people like this guy. But we want people like this person, you know, who has skills and can, like, make our nation great or something.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. And I think even among the good people that we bring, we're starting to lose to nations that have more open policies like Canada. So people, if you go to Canada to get your PhD, you can stay after you finish your PhD while you're looking for a job. In the United States, if you finish your PhD and you don't have a job,
you have to leave.
You gotta go.
Yeah.
And these are highly qualified people who've lived in the United States for a long time, who who speak English, who are highly educated and have great potential for the workforce, and we just kick boot them. And so these are serious issues about human rights, but we say because they're not Americans, you know, they're not sort of guaranteed those same human rights.
Yeah.
Which is, to me, I think, as long as we have that sort of outlook, human rights is always going to be a hollow shell.
Yeah, and I think, as going back to an earlier point I said, at the same time, there's a problem if you just sort of have this idea that we'll just let anybody in with no checks on it. Anyone, free movement of peoples, you know, the country would collapse. Like, the system, like a...
I'm not sure about that.
I don't know, I mean...
I'm not convinced.
I guess we disagree. But I guess more like it would threaten, like, sovereignty of a nation state.
Absolutely.
If you say that, like, people can just move in and out without checks and balances, because then the real question is, well, how's the government going to fund itself? Who's going to, like... How are you going to collect taxes? How are you going to, like, preserve voting records? Right. How do you, like, make sure that you still have a representative government based on, like, citizens voting? How do you, like, maintain, you know, like any semblance of, like, social services if you don't know where the money's coming from, or if you're not getting enough money because if no one's going to pay taxes if they could just leave, right? Or if, you know, and so I think that, because I feel like there's this just tension of, like, we know that abuse of immigrants is bad. At the same time, and I'm just personally speaking, total free movement of peoples, I think, it would mean sort of the total collapse of, like, the political community and of nation states as we know it. Well, some people would say, well, that's a good thing, and let's, like, accelerate that process. I might be a little less... I'm more hesitant, because I don't know if the alternative to that is good. It either seems to be a kind of anarchy, or the idea is that we just need to have a more broader global governance, which also carries a whole bag load of problems.
Well, so yeah, to me it goes back to the kindergarten lesson we learn of sharing and how much people are willing to share. So, like, what you were talking about with the immigrants is sort of like, okay, so they come when they're 17 and then they get free college that I've paid taxes for the last 20 years.
Yeah, and this is a Trumpian point, and I don't want to make, you know, I don't ever want to, I hate Trump. I think, though, that Trump has this really uncanny knack to, like, poke a hole, like, really stick his finger in issues that really get people worked up in the country.
Yes.
And so I think, like, he has all the wrong answers, but he has an uncanny knack of identifying all the right problems.
Right.
And I think, you know, immigration is a huge issue, and I don't think it's, like, a light issue. Like, so I feel like it's facile for people to say, like, we just need to let everybody in, because, like, as I said earlier, that seems to, like, sort of, like, how the country wouldn't work if you do that. On the flip side, it's also horrible what we're doing to people. Like, our immigration system is totally horrible, and it's horrible what we're doing to people.
Yeah, so I think the problem here, getting back to our main issue and to close out the sort of episode, is human rights and the nation seem to be contradictory at a certain point.
Yeah, exactly.
And we need to sort of look back at these historical examples of where they clashed. So say Haiti claiming their human rights and the nation state of France rejecting the claim of the human rights. You look at these examples and see the sort of mistakes that have happened before in order to inform the sort of next decisions that we make. That's my plug for history.
Or we just create world empire.
Go ahead.
We're just going to create one giant empire in which, you know...
And there's Neil Ferguson's comment for the day.
Hey, no, Niall. Isn't that his name? Yeah. By the way, Niall Ferguson, also a terrible guy. Did you hear about that?
He's a great author.
He writes great, but like he's a terrible person. Great author, terrible person. But like, did you hear about that at Stanford?
Yeah.
Yeah, anyways, Niall Ferguson spied on an undergraduate at Stanford because the student was a leftist. Oh my god, you know. It's not like Niall Ferguson is like...
Shows dedication to work? No. What a weird, creepy thing to do.
Yeah.
But,
violation of human rights.
Yeah, but anyway, I just made that comment because, yes, he tends to be an apologist for empire.
But that is something that also, there's a trend in this talk of human rights, is this weird idea that empires were better at solving these problems. Because, yeah, empires have problems, but at least they don't have the same tension that we have in the world of nation states with human rights and civic rights. Because an empire just says, you're just under the empire and you just gotta do what we tell you, damn it. And we're gonna mediate differences, because an empire... by definition, is based on different types of government for different peoples, right? Different types of governance for different peoples, as long as all those people recognize the total power of the empire.
Right, and that's where empire is so interesting, because you'll find apologists both in the metropole and in the colony for empire.
Because they say it's better than the nation state.
I'd rather be ruled by Britain than be in civil war with all these people in India.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, so that's our discussion on human rights. Hopefully we should talk about empire soon, because it seems like
that
there's
would be
a
a good
lot
segue,
there.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, as always, you can check out hourofhistory.com/blog for extra discussion about some of our episode topics. I'm going to be writing a little bit about Cuba, and maybe Mathias will be contributing a little bit about what he's reading this summer, because he's reading voraciously. So
reading a lot about the Russian Empire, coincidentally enough.
So you'll have to write us something for that. Thanks again for joining us on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place.
Have a good one.